I'm very excited to join you all, especially after that wonderful kickoff and all of the excitement building around the program today. People don't typically turn to economists for enthusiasm. It's not called the dismal science for nothing, but I will do my best to keep it rolling here and at the very least share some information that I hope you'll find valuable and help spark some of that motivation to continue searching for those innovative solutions in your work. I wanted to start off real quick for those of you who might not be familiar with Chmura, a little bit of background on our company. As you heard, we provide labor market data and analysis primarily through our JobsEQ technology platform, which brings together all of the economic and workforce and labor market data that you could need into one place at a very detailed level. So you can go into granular stats for your counties, zip codes, even block level, and find out what's going on in your region. We were founded in 1998 by our chief economist and CEO, Christine Chmura. I've grown to offices in Richmond and Cleveland. And really what drives us in our day-to-day work is our client satisfaction and success, with excellence in our work being our first priority. JobsEQ was built out of some of the work that Chris was doing with workforce development boards that she served on in Virginia, and it's really built around saving you that time on finding the data so that you can find data that you trust and put it into use and your practice day to day. If you like what you hear today about some of the economic update that I'm going to go through shortly, I'd encourage you to sign up for our complimentary weekly economic updates. Kind of link here. We put these out on a weekly basis, and basically as short as what you see here on a few pages, summarizing what are the key trends going on in the economy that you should be aware of and how they might impact your work. With that, I will jump right into the meat of the discussion today and what's happening in the labor force. And as you might expect, quite a bit. There's a lot of turmoil going on and things are changing very rapidly. So I do want to encourage you, as I'm presenting today, to use that chat feature. I have it up on the side of my screen if you see me glance over every once in a while and keeping an eye on it. And I've also let Amanda know that she should feel free to interrupt me if there's chats that I've missed, to make sure that we make this relevant for you and you get all the information that you need. So outline of what we're going to talk about today over the next hour or so. I want to start off with a national economic update and what's happening in the national conditions. The labor market is exceptionally tight. It has been tight all throughout the pandemic and continues to be. But the key message and driver of the economy at this point is all the talk about inflation. Inflation is high, and the Federal Reserve is committed to combating it, and that has implications that we'll get into for the workforce, for unemployment, and for what you might be seeing ahead in your own work. We have, just as of the last quarter, incorporated a recession into our likely forecast for next year. I'll talk through some of the rationale for that and why it looks like we're not in a recession currently, but what you can expect going forward. At the state level, I have a few data points on California performing above the national average in many areas, but we're also seeing some of those signs of a slowdown at the national level and in California. Go through a couple of variations around the state, and I Also want to show you some of the real-time labor market information from JobsEQ. Go through that in a little bit more interactive format for you and show you what's happening as of data we collected yesterday. So start off with the national overview, and the headline story, the topic starting off any financial and economic news is inflation. Being a broad increase in the overall price of goods. You're seeing this at the gas pump, you're seeing it at grocery stores. There's two different measures that we tend to look at in tracking this in the economy. The current consumer price index, or CPI, is what you're most likely to hear about in the headline. It's a basket of goods that's kept the same and tracked over time. So if you think about going to a grocery store and filling up on certain food items and tracking those price changes, but on a much larger scale and down to button-down shirts and home workout equipment and all of the different bundles of goods that you might be looking at. You can see in the red line here that recently it's much above the previous trend over the past decade, and why inflation is so high in the news. The second measure that we look at is the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index, or PCE. This is actually the preferred indicator for the Federal Reserve that they've indicated to track inflation. It tends to be a little bit lower than the CPI. And part of that is in how it's constructed. Instead of looking at a single basket of goods and tracking it over time, it accounts for how people are changing their spending. So if you go to the store and find that meat is too expensive lately, maybe it's time to buy a bit more rice or beans, other staples, maybe more peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunches. As you change those purchases and in response to prices, that is also considered in the personal consumption expenditures. So that's why it's down a little bit, but still, by any measure, inflation lately is at a 40-year high. And we've seen a little bit of drop in the most recent data. It's certainly not at the highest peak level, but the concern is that it becomes permanent, that it's ingrained in consumer behavior, in business behavior. So what really was driving this? Initially, the lockdown, the COVID lockdown, shifted a lot of the demand away from services. You can no longer go out to eat or go find entertainment or get a haircut, and switch to goods, which was compounded the problem with the supply chain issues. And so we got increased demand for those goods and lower supply as companies faced all of the supply chain issues and difficulties getting it. That drove up prices for a lot of those goods, and a lot of the initial discussion around inflation was assuming that the price increases were driven coming out of the pandemic and because of some of these shifts. Since then, it is evident that the inflation has become more ingrained and more widespread. Broader-based inflation is taking hold, and so the Federal Reserve is signaling some pretty harsh measures to work to counteract that. The inflation was also driven somewhat by the stimulus, which boosted some of those personal savings. Here's the personal saving rate over time. I've marked a few points for the various stimulus payments. And you can see how households were able to save and recover some of the debt that they might have had and make it through the worst of the pandemic. But now the savings rate is continuing to decline and at lower levels than prior to the start of the pandemic, which is an indication that households are using some of those excess savings from shifting their spending and from the stimulus to buy themselves a little bit of time and in making choices about the labor market and returning to work and what type of work they're looking for, which also supports that the labor market is really tight. And when I say that, I mean the matching of workers to jobs. There are fewer available workers to fill jobs. This is seen in the unemployment rate, which I've got here. We're as of September 2022, the very latest data, at the national level, we're back down to a 3.5% unemployment rate, which matches January 2020 prior to the pandemic. So as tight as the labor market was before the pandemic, it has remained tight and quickly gotten back to that point. The participation rate is also remaining low here. And labor force participation here means people who are looking for work or while unemployed or who are currently working. It does not include people who have retired or are in school or are otherwise not interested in work. So when the pandemic hit, the labor force participation fell from above 63% down here to just above 60% nationwide. It's slowly been creeping back. As of September, we hit 62.3% again, but it's really leveled off here. So we're seeing a lot of people who are not participating in the labor force anymore, who might have before, and that tightening of labor market conditions, which means that employers might have to do a little bit more to find workers to fill their job opening. The quit rate also remains high here. So a lot of people lost their job at the beginning of the recession, especially service sector and in-person jobs, and began looking for other things. The increase in remote work made it a little bit easier to expand the geographic search for jobs and find some of those higher paying jobs. I see a comment here about 16+ million people with long COVID. I actually do have a slide on that coming up. And just laying out the problem here. And I'll get to some of what's keeping people out. So we're still seeing a lot of movement in people quitting their jobs and moving around. That's leveled off a little bit, but it remains high. So all this is to say, when you are working with employers who are having trouble finding workers, this is also showing up in wages. The wage and salary disbursements here, as measured by the employment cost index for private sector workers, it's up over 11% in February 2022. It's up 8.6% in August 2022. Inflation has entered the conversation and the regular discourse around pay, and wages tend to lag inflation growth. So workers are expecting to be compensated more highly. and have some additional leeway in a tighter labor market, and with shifting priorities over COVID in what kinds of jobs they're looking for and will take. So I've spent a lot of time talking about inflation, and hopefully tied it into a few different things, but I do want to explicitly call out why inflation is not good for long-term economic growth. First being here that it is a regressive tax, meaning that it impacts lower income people and households more than higher incomes. You can think about this as the percentage of household income that goes towards the items like food, energy, clothing, housing. And when the price of all of these things goes up, it takes a larger chunk out of the household budget. So it also is distorting decision making, especially for businesses. If you think about maybe a construction company that is anticipating prices for their raw materials, steel and lumber will be going up and up and up and up. It might make sense to buy now, given the current workload that you expect, and buy excess of those materials in order to stockpile and have it available at a lower price. When the economy starts slowing and trending down, that inventory just sits and waiting on new projects, and can make it harder and extend the recessions and correction and getting back to those projects. As we saw, when inflation expectations are unanchored and entering into everyday decisions, it can spiral upward with wages rising, which can be helpful for workers who are able to negotiate those wages and take advantage of the tight labor market. But you're also going to hear businesses concerned about the rising wages and the ability to conduct business. The Federal Reserve is committed to, it has a dual mandate that they have to work for. They have to keep unemployment low and keep inflation and inflation expectation low. And if the Federal Reserve continues to raise interest rates and it raises rates too frequently or too high, and slows down the economy too rapidly, it can lead to a recession, a general slowdown in economic activity. And you may have heard the soft landing in the news. I looked around for a better picture, but I just love the airplane here about to go off the cliff. It's a hard target for the Federal Reserve to hit. It takes about 6 to 9 months for interest rate decisions to make their way through the economy. And a lot of things can change over that period. And trying to hit the exact mark of a good monetary position and lowering those interest rates without increasing unemployment and slowing the economy too much is a very hard target to hit. I've got a few quotes from people at the Federal Reserve, in this case, the chair, Jerome Powell, that provide a little bit more context on this and what they're thinking about here. Restoring price stability, in this case, meaning slowing that inflation to where it's no longer a part of the conversation. It takes time and requires using tools forcefully to bring things back into balance. They anticipate a sustained period of below trend growth, which is another way of saying slowing the economy and hopefully not pushing it negative, but slow growth. Moreover, there will likely be some softening of labor market conditions. So the tight labor market conditions that we've seen over the past few years should slacken, meaning higher unemployment, lower hiring, some softening of that wage pressure, a very different environment than some of you may have been working in over the past few years, and even prior to COVID, during that period of economic growth. And really telling here, that combination of higher interest rates, lower growth, and softer labor market conditions needed to bring down inflation, can be expected to bring some pain to households and businesses. It's the unfortunate cost in the Federal Reserve's view, but the expectations that, as we talked about, that with the problems of long-term inflation, that restoring price stability or failure to restore price stability would mean greater pain in the long run. Jason Furman was the chair of the chief economic advisors under the Obama administration, and was quoted in the Wall Street Journal in September as saying, to bring price increases down, we may need to tolerate unemployment of 6.5% for 2 years, at the national level at least. And that should give you an idea of what it takes to bring down inflation. As we talked about, hitting that soft landing is pretty difficult. And just a month after that last quote, the Federal Reserve Chair admitted that his chances of a soft landing are likely to diminish. No one knows if that will necessarily lead to a recession or how significant that might be, but they've learned about the failures in the 70s and 80s. And to just briefly talk about some of that, here in red is that consumer price index again, that measure of inflation. Green is the federal funds effective rate, what the Federal Reserve uses to set interest rate. And blue is gross domestic product, a broad measure of economic activity. But just to point out, in 1980s, the inflation was rising. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates in order to combat it. Saw a bit of a slowdown in the inflation and steeply lowered interest rates, believing that the inflation had been cured and avoiding a prolonged recession. Recession bars in gray here show you the periods of recession. Inflation, in fact, came back, started rising again by 1982, and Federal Reserve had to increase the interest rates again, sending into what was called a double dip recession, and ended up a much longer and more prolonged recession as inflation started to slow and the interest rates were gradually lowered. So in the interest of avoiding this kind of double dip recession, we'd expect the Federal Reserve to maintain those slow conditions and the higher interest rates for until there's overwhelming evidence that inflation has slowed. What about corporate greed as a driver of inflation? Wages have been stagnant for many years. They're at inflated cost of things, actually due to intentional price gouging. That's a great question, Kim. Thanks for sharing that. There are certainly some measures of corporate profits in the recent data that are showing high levels of corporate profits. Wages are finally catching up after being stagnant for so many years. But the inflation is now broadly based and in so many different parts of everyday life that it's necessitating this larger action by the Federal Reserve. When we look at what we might expect for a recession, historical context is a little tricky because the last two recessions were really unusual. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, very short, technically only a couple of months, and the extended Great Recession, which is the largest slowdown since the Great Depression. So some people define a recession. In fact, most of the world defines a recession as two back-to-back slowdowns in GDP. But in the US, we look at several different measures, and I'll quickly go through some of these. But the National Bureau of Economic Research is actually who determines whether we're in a recession or not, and look at a lot more measures than just GDP. And I think we see signs that we're not in a recession currently, but it is coming in our forecast. So employment continues to grow, recently surpassed the pre-pandemic levels. And we saw those tight labor market conditions. The previous data was from a survey of businesses. If you look at households, you also see recovery and growth as people are returning to work, although it's been flattening off a little bit, slowing down, signs of a slowdown there a little bit. We've taken a look at the personal income in real terms, adjusted for inflation. It's been flattening, declining slightly here. And consumer spending is really important in the overall economic health. It accounts for about 70% of gross domestic product. As these are people going out and spending and moving money around in the economy. And on a real basis, you can see it continues to grow, but has been flattening off, again, showing some initial signs of slowdown. And as a part of that, retail and food sales make up a large chunk of that consumer spending, and have certainly dropped recently after flattening off. If any of you work with manufacturers, the industrial production is a measure of a lot of the manufacturing productivity and what's coming out of manufacturing. It's become less watched as manufacturing has become a much smaller portion of the national economy, but we are seeing a slight decline in industrial production in August. And another indication of some recent growth, but maybe some slowing conditions.
There's a question in the chat from Mr. Rainey. Is productivity outpacing wage growth? If so, it moved. How much are higher wages due to tight labor markets driving inflation?
Yeah, great question. I don't have the data on productivity versus wage growth at my fingertips, but it has certainly been decoupled for decades. The wage growth in recent years has been a lot higher than we've seen for many years. And part of that is just attracting workers in tight labor markets. People are, that competition for the best employment and even just filling jobs can certainly increase the wages that are being offered. In the past year or so, it's become much more tied to inflation as people are noticing the prices of everyday purchases going up and using that as the justification and need for demanding those higher wages. I also see, I get the idea that the president does not control the economy too much, at least now that there are extraneous forces at work. Your thoughts? Yeah, even the Federal Reserve, which is mandated to try and control these economic conditions only has a few different levers that they can use, especially on the interest rates here. The president has a lot of influence in setting those expectations, and I doubt that we would hear any politician mention the words recession for a good long while, just for that political sake and encouraging that optimism. But the U.S. economy in particular is huge, and there's some influence to be had, but certainly not in control by the president. And yeah, Amanda, the unemployment at 6.5% accelerated is really a big takeaway here, I'd say. I have to fix this graph a little bit because COVID has thrown things off. So if I zoom in a little bit, we see that real gross domestic product has certainly slowed. And looking into that mid-2023 area, our forecast is including a recession period, hopefully short and not anything like the large drop from the Great Recession and from COVID, but an extended period of even not in a declining period, but beyond it coming out of the recession, that extended period of slower growth is expected as the Fed continues to fight inflation. So to summarize there, interest rates are the big story, expected to rise and hold, possibly a little too long and overshoot that soft landing. So we're incorporating a highly likely recession. I expect overall easing of those tight labor market conditions as the unemployment rate rises and extended subpar growth in employment. Of course, the national economic conditions are very different in each of the states. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the California indicators that we've got. Looking just at employment percent change from a year ago, as of August, California was number 9 in the nation. Grew 4% over the year, right in the middle of some of the neighboring states. Oregon was ranked 7, slightly higher. Very tight at around that 9, 10, 11 slot, as Washington also grew 4%. So outpacing a lot of the national growth and still seeing a lot of demand and employment demand in California. Looking at the monthly employment, as of September, California employment has just barely almost reached the pre-COVID peak. It's less than 1% away, about 24,000 jobs, and very well after revisions may be seen to have reached it. But that's a great sign for the current economy, and I'd expect a lot of you are seeing high demand from any of the employers that you work with, and more workers coming into your offices and into work and looking for some of those opportunities. Breaking that up into industries, there's a lot of numbers on the page here, and I recognize that, and I've tried to highlight a few. I will look at the quarterly data as of the first quarter of 2022, trying to get at some of these details. Several of the industries still are not where they were pre-COVID. We saw at the state level, it's only just reached, but retail trade, accommodation and food services, the hotels and restaurants, education, manufacturing, all of these highlighted here continue to grow, but still not quite recovered. These are a lot of the in-person and service-related industries that were most heavily impacted by the pandemic. I didn't highlight it for some reason actually, but the arts, entertainment, and recreation kind of highly impacted, COVID-impacted area, still well below the pre-pandemic peak, and that's when you're trying to find workers and work with businesses, maybe a little harder to place some of those. We're also seeing growth recently and expected continued growth even into the recession period in some high-paying industries. I've highlighted a couple here: healthcare and social assistance, especially with the pandemic, but also the demographics and aging population generally have driven demand for healthcare for years, and they're expected to continue to do so. Professional and scientific and technical services tend to require a bit more highly specialized skills and greater education. And you see that in the compensation, average wages here, and faster growth. Transportation and warehousing has really been booming nationwide, and especially in California, with the uptick in e-commerce over the pandemic. And even with the supply chain issues, recovered well above the pre-pandemic period and expected to continue growing. And information, as you might expect, even with the announcement of a lot of layoffs and hiring freezes at some of the large tech companies around the state, still a strong industry with high compensation, and has been seeing growth over the past 2 years. Diving down into the, I see a quick question just to piggyback on Amanda's comment to point out what we all know: higher unemployment disproportionately impacts the most economically vulnerable communities and people of color. That's absolutely true, Tim, and thank you for sharing that. We saw it in the initial impacts from the pandemic, that a lot of the most impacted industries and occupations were in those service sector jobs, and disproportionately held by some of these vulnerable communities and people of color, and that the continuing issues coming out of the pandemic and expected in a period of higher unemployment would certainly affect those communities. We saw differences at the state level compared to the nation. There are, of course, differences all throughout the state, and in some of these conditions. I picked out just a couple indicators here. We talk a lot about the unemployment rate, and see that it ranges throughout the state from below 3%, very low unemployment rate, shown in kind of white around some of the employment centers, to, and some of the more, some of the counties more on the outskirts of the state, and maybe more rural areas, up to greater than 6, almost 7% already, as of August 2022. So when you're looking at the impact of a higher unemployment on workers around the state, it's going to be very different depending on where your community is starting from and the current unemployment level, where you might expect to have even higher and more difficult and extended periods of unemployment in areas that already have high unemployment rates. I've got a question here. Do you happen to have any data specific to employment and re-entry workers? I wonder if you can clarify what you mean by re-entry workers. I can think of a couple different answers, but I do have some information coming up on people who are re-entering the workforce.
Is it okay to talk, or do you prefer in the chat?
Sure, go ahead.
Persons with criminal records.
Okay, that was my guess. I don't have any employment or any data on employment of people with criminal records. They are not particularly well tracked, which is probably a blessing for a lot of people in the with that history and the different challenges that they face in returning to work. But it makes it challenging to track, unfortunately.
If I may just comment really quickly, Johns Hopkins did some very cool research some years ago. They purposely, you may or may not know this, but they purposely hired reentry job seekers and found that they had fewer HR problems with them than with their other workers, which has been my personal experience. And I always thought that was very cool, and kudos to your employer for that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to hear it. There's been several studies that have shown reducing the that criminal background check has been very beneficial in helping employers hire the workers that they need, and in helping people with a criminal background, as you might expect, in finding work, which again, as we're thinking about equity, tends to impact the communities of color more. And so it is, if you're ever talking with employers or get a chance to really question some of those background hiring questions, is it really necessary in the type of work if they're not interacting with customers on a day-to-day basis, or not handling sensitive material or something? Is that really a necessary check? So thanks for sharing that.
Thanks.
I also highlighted here the change in employment over the last year across the counties in California. And this is almost the inverse of the unemployment rate that we just saw, where a lot of the, as you might expect, a lot of the faster growing areas tend to have a better matching of workers and jobs available. I'm already seeing a few areas in red here that have declined on a year-over-year basis. So in thinking about the impacts of a future slowdown and possible recession, are some areas that you might need to spend a little extra focus and get ahead of some of this if possible.
How are you?
At the state level, we've talked a little bit about the labor force participation. I want to speed through a little bit of this, I think, but California's labor force participation actually has generally been above the national level. It's shown here in red. Prior to the pandemic, it got up to 63.4%, well above the blue line here. But as of the latest data, tied with the nation at 62.3%. So definitely still some room to recover in bringing people back into the labor force and finding work. And part of that, and driving some of that question of where are workers and what's keeping them from working. Part of the story, we can expand the definition of unemployment. We tend to look at what's called U3 unemployment rate in national headlines and at the state, and that's shown here in blue. And that's people who have looked for work recently and are actively trying to look for work. If you expand that definition a little bit and include, you can include other parts of labor force and get a little bit of a different idea of what's going on, although the data are not quite as up to date here. But we'll just kind of add bit by bit. So we can add discouraged workers in green. And these are people who have given up on working because they believe there's no jobs available to be had, or certainly not for them. But they would still be open to work if they maybe believed that there was an opportunity for them. So that's shown in green here, not anywhere near the pre-pandemic level. but also not nearly as high as coming out of the Great Recession with the jobless recovery here. In purple, we add other marginally attached workers. These are people who, just for other reasons, not just discouragement, have not been looking for a job over the past few weeks. So they're shown in purple here, basically following the same trend. And in red is the largest group. If we take the total unemployed plus those marginally attached and discouraged workers, plus people who are only working part-time but would prefer to work full-time, as a percentage of the total labor force. You can see not nearly as sharp an increase in unemployment here over the pandemic, but eventually reaching a much higher point over about 18% here at its peak. And it's been gradually going down, but really showing expanding that definition of who's not working and looking into some of those reasons and who's not working as much as they might like, really shows a different story about what's going on with workers right now. So I promised some additional information on what's keeping people out of the labor force and where are they. There's been some research at the national level that I want to share here, some of the key findings. Between 2019 and 2021, workers aged 55 and older, the likelihood of them leaving the labor force increased 50%, but they didn't go into retirement. The likelihood of retiring increased only 1 percentage point, according to this study. I've got citations at the bottom here, but the authors indicate is that means we can expect some of the older workers to possibly re-enter the labor market once they consider it safer to work, once there's no longer the health concerns as much. And meanwhile, they're using some of those other income sources and postponing collecting Social Security. That has had another ripple effect on better job opportunities. So the young people aged 16 to 24 actually had the largest contribution to labor force participation rate in a study from 2016 through middle 2022. And part of this is attributed to some of those exits from older workers, freeing up and creating some more space for career progression and more jobs up the job ladder, higher up the job ladder. Another study also found some shifts in preferences, where workers preferred, were able to reevaluate things during the recession and look at what was growing during the pandemic, and have a lower preference from low skilled and customer facing jobs due to COVID. And number of work hours that they want to work has also declined in one study, especially for jobs with a higher exposure risk for COVID-19. I've got a picture of the kid here for around the number of desired work hours. Some of that is preferences and reprioritization of concern about family members and children during the pandemic. Some of that is childcare employment has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels, and childcare remains a difficulty for a lot of working parents and parents who are considering work, particularly when childcare costs are rising and it might not make financial sense to enroll someone in childcare and go in order to work and make less than you're paying for daycare. So showing here still 6,600 jobs below the pre-pandemic peak for California. Someone mentioned long COVID earlier, and I'm glad that you did, because it's certainly a piece here. The link to this Solve Long COVID initiative has some great data. And by their estimates, about 6% of the California population has long COVID as of January 2022, with those symptoms potentially preventing work and impacting work. And that accounts for over 800,000 Californians with disabling long COVID. That's certainly a component of the labor force participation here. So we've talked a lot about recession and outlook here. How might California do if a recession is at the extent of the Great Recession? That was a 7.7% decline. It's not called the Great Recession for nothing, though, and so we're looking at hopefully that would be considered an upper range of decline for the state. But that makes it really important. I have just a couple minutes left here, and I'd love to give you a brief demo of some of our real-time information in Jobs EQ. So I've got it up here. This is our Jobs EQ platform pulling in job postings data on a daily basis. The chart at the top here shows job post volume over time over the last year. So blue is for each week over the last year, and gray is over the same period a year ago. So you can see for much of 2022, job posting volume has been higher than the previous year in California, but we're starting to see some of those slowdowns in job posts, indicating some hesitancy in hiring from a lot of these workers and businesses, and potentially fewer job opportunities, and staying on top of the specific hiring demands and skills and occupations in demand can really help you in helping to find those opportunities, especially in a slowing economy. So just to scroll through some of the data available in here, I do want to add wages to the additional data here, because there's a lot of information on wages in ads that are currently posted. As of January 1, 2023, I believe, California will require online ads to include wage ranges. And so this data set is going to be even further expanded and show you the wage ranges. You saw how important that is in the correlation between wages and inflation right now. And this could definitely be helpful in your conversations with employers about what wages they're offering and their difficulty attracting any workers. We can see the typical occupations that are being requested in online ads right now around California, ranging from retail sales and registered nurses, software developers, particularly in IT heavy areas. Where those ads are located, seeing a lot in
Good morning, Ms. Stovall.
Los Angeles,
Good morning.
San Francisco, and San Diego.
Oh,
And
wow.
I would ask, if you are speaking, to please mute yourself. And I do also want to point out we collect the employers who are posting these ads, which can help as you're looking to engage with the employers in your community who are hiring and trying to hire, and make sure that you have that full workforce network of employers that you can work with. We pull the certifications and skills out of online ads. Driver's license, as you might expect, is really important, just being able to access that job. And then a lot of healthcare certifications are really well defined. And again, with those wages, you can see the payoff in including some of those certifications. And it can be really helpful in showing some of the motivation for workers and considering entering a program, showing the expected change in work and wages that they can command. Hard skills and soft skills here, and education levels. I also do want to just briefly point out the remote job ads that are available, and honestly, what a small percentage of ads that those make up. A lot of the ads don't indicate whether it's remote or not. So I went through that really quickly. I'll scroll up a little bit here to the certifications and skills, because Amanda mentioned that she likes them, but I want to take a chance for any questions and look back over some of these questions here. So feel free to ask any questions that you might have in the chat in the remaining couple of minutes here. But I see one from Kim. Do you have any data on the increase in the number of jobs that are union as workers continue to advocate for unionization? That's a great question. We do have some unionization data, but it's not tracked over time. But what we can do, I wonder, we have a robust keyword search in the job postings data here. And if we just search for the keyword union, which is probably not the tightest search, but might give us a bit of an idea, a pretty flat number of jobs which mention union, at least since June. Slight increase earlier in the year, but consistent, but definitely at levels above a year ago in 2021. Yeah. I've got about a minute left in my scheduled time. Are there any other questions?
Will you share these slides with me so I can share them with the community?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll share them once we finish up here.
How do we go about getting to try Jobs EQ? I'm curious to play with it.
That's great. I will also send my contact information with the slides, and feel free to reach out to me, and we can set you up with a demo and let you click around.
Patrick, would you mind putting your email in the chat?
That's it. Yeah.
I'm watching to see if there's more questions. Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you, Patrick. Can we give Patrick some praise in the chat? Thank you so much.